If you've bought this, you presumably know who Bill Rebane is. He's not, I think, as well known as he might be. He doesn't even have the kind of cult followings that Herschel Gordon Lewis or Andy Milligan or Ray Dennis Steckler or Al Adamson have. But it seemed that from the 60s through to the 80s, it's like every state had an independent genre filmmaker working there. Every small town, almost every region had somebody who was out there, usually running their own little studio, maybe making industrial films or adverts for local businesses, but at the same time clawing together the funds and the personnel to make weird little independent genre pictures. One of the great hits of this market was Charles Pierce's The Legend of Boggy Creek, which wasn't quite the first Bigfoot movie, but it was the one that really broke everybody who was making horror films in the backwoods areas of America. Wanted to make a Bigfoot film, get some of that Bigfoot action. Rebane actually left it quite late. He made Rana, the creature from Shadow Lake, which is more of a Gillman movie than a Bigfoot movie, but it's a cryptid picture. It's a film about a local legend. Quite late in the day, in 1979, he made The Capture of Bigfoot. It's a snowman picture rather than a forest picture. It's about a Bigfoot of the snows, so he's white. And there's a little crossover with Hammer's The Abominable Snowman. But that was obviously a form that was appealing to backwoods filmmakers. And we are talking about that rung of activity that's a bit below Herschel Gordon Lewis, who had a particular style, or even Andy Milligan. We are talking the Charles Pierces, maybe Frederick Friedel, maybe William Greffe, all these people who had runs of movies, little clutches of films, some terrible, some surprisingly watchable. They were drive-in staples in the 1970s, and then VHS staples in the 1980s, and sadly now grainy YouTube rips from VHS staples now. I'm hoping that we'll see a project of releasing more and more of these things, so you can actually appreciate that there's some genuine artistry and an interest going on in these. And a lot of these things, because they were made by people who came and went, their films have kind of fallen into public domain, or fake public domain, which is to say that they seem to be fair game for people to rip off. And so you get multiple versions under multiple titles floating around. Rebane was born in Latvia in 1937, moved to America in 1952, and did various sort of technical wizardry backgroundy things in film, mostly in the Chicago area. And sometime in the 1960s, he decided he wanted to direct a science fiction film. And he set out to make a film which he called Terror at Half Day, which is, I suppose, a very low-budget version of the Quatermass experiment, or closer to the first man in outer space. Astronaut comes back transformed into a monster and wanders around killing people. He hired a very tall fellow whose stage name was Henry Height to play the astronaut, and then didn't actually get much footage with him, and he didn't complete the film. And Herschel Gordon Lewis, who is the nearest thing we've got to a superstar mogul in this era, needed a B picture for a double bill he was putting out, and rather than make a whole one himself, he bought the footage from Terror at Half Day and turned it into this thing called Monster A Go-Go. He added a bit of footage himself and seemed to have slapped it together, and presumably people didn't riot and tear down the cinemas where it was shown, although Rebane has said he thinks it's the worst film ever made. It's certainly the worst film with his name on it. After that, Rebane waited 9 years before trying it again. And in the interim, he left town and moved to Wisconsin, established a studio, a production facility there. And in the 70s and into the 80s, he produced, directed, and wrote a series of all science fiction horror films, one or two with often rather elderly name actors brought in. And this was a thing of regional horror. If you could get Buster Crabbe for a day, he would come down, he'd play the sheriff, sit behind a desk, read his lines, go home, and then his name would be huge on the screen. And so you have these weird fluke credits for all kinds of people from the 30s and 40s. Interestingly, quite often what these filmmakers would do, Al Adamson in particular was a fan of it, and Richard Gordon, the producer, probably started it, was they would look to the films they'd loved as children, and they would hire the fading cowboy stars of the 1940s to come and be in films, or the knockabout comedians from like childish movies. Yeah, Ed Wood hiring Bela Lugosi is very much in that style. The Giant Spider Invasion has Barbara Hale from Perry Mason and Steve Brody in it. Yeah, and yeah, kind of cool people. Ralph Meeker is in the Alpha Incident. And George Buck Flower, who's one of those people you'll know the face, is in The Capture of Bigfoot and the Alpha Incident. So he drew on people, but otherwise it's community theatre. And one of the things I love about these films is the sense of community, the sense that everybody's pitching in. It's like, okay, maybe they're a bit awkward sometimes. And everybody jokes about the giant spider invasion because it has a giant spider that's built on a Volkswagen chassis. And it's kind of a ridiculous thing. Weirdly, I suspect it would look quite impressive live because it's like a carnival parade float rather than a film special effect. Actually, the rest of the film has much better special effects and actually some quite creepy mangled corpses and some weird spider effects, but you remember the big stupid spider, don't you? It's also, of his films, probably the best paced. It feels more like a Poverty Row Hollywood film, but a Hollywood film. Whereas Invasion from Inner Earth, later released as They, that's his official first feature. And that's an Invasion of the Body Snatchers, invisible aliens type movie with some flying saucers that you very briefly see that are supposed to have come from a hollow earth, and they're of the pie plate on string variety of flying saucer, but it's like very weirdly somnolent. It's an apocalypse with only 2 or 3 people on screen most of the time. When the influence of 2001 filtered down to community theatre level, there was a sort of sense that science fiction films needed to end with a big head scratchy what was going on there moment, and certainly Invasion from Inner Earth has that. What it's got that it introduces is a sense of the Wisconsin landscape. There's a lot of snow in Rebane's films. I mean, they say The Capture of Bigfoot is the Bigfoot on versus skiers film, and Demons of Ludlow is not a characteristic Rebane film. It's got weird supernatural elements. Most of his films were more in the science fiction mode. It seemed his influences were more Martian invaders. There's a Martian disease in the Alpha Incident, which is an enclosed outbreak type movie. But his studio facilities had just been sublet by Yuli Lommel, who's a slightly higher profile genre auteur, partly because he made The Tenderness of Wolves and had a vague association with Rainer Werner Fassbinder, but he had a big hit with The Boogeyman in the early 80s, and then on the back of that made a whole bunch of other films. Olivia is quite an interesting one, but The Devonsville Terror is a Salem witch curse type thing. And it's almost like he came to town, made that in Rebane's studio. Rebane thought, well, I'll do one of those as well. And so The Demons of Ludlow is that kind of film. It's a witch's curse, small community, weird stuff happens. And I think this is the watermark of Rebane's genre work, is weird stuff happens. Sometimes rather awkwardly and strangely. And sometimes awkwardness can be genuinely disturbing. I think The Demons of Ludlow has some genuinely disturbing moments. There's a a dream sequence where a girl with learning difficulties has a nightmare in which she seems to be dragged back into the past and torn apart by these frilly shirted aristocrats who have claws. And it's a film about a haunted piano. It's a piano that sounds like an electric harpsichord, but is supposed to be witch cursed. And it has intrusions of the past into the present in a way that's either inept or surreal. I think that it's a combination of both. Back to back with that, he made a film called The Cold, also known as The Game, which has a terrific found location. It's on a huge abandoned resort in the snow. And so Rebane's films quite often have a genuinely chilly, outdoorsy feel. That's distinctive. He wasn't particularly one for narrative drive, but I think that has something more to do with the way exploitation films were in the 1970s. There's a weird aimlessness to a lot of them. They're very easy to characterize as walking around in the woods films. With Rebane, it's more often walking around in the snow. Although, for contrast, the giant spider invasion is set during a heat wave. So, yeah, there's a lot of walking around sweating in that. Rebane is technically quite a good filmmaker, but there is almost always a sense of stretched resources, of will make do. And quite often you have the feeling that he's not spent as much time working on his scripts as he has getting in the money or recruiting local businessmen to appear in it, and just in thinking of ideas. And so there's a sort of droning nature to the dialogue, which can sometimes be mind-numbing, but sometimes can also be rather effective. There's a peculiar, grainy, late-at-night atmosphere to his films. And there are films that I mostly saw on VHS in the 80s, although the giant spider invasion did actually get a theatrical release in Britain. And it was one of those films, it was so astonishing that people kept putting it out as a B picture to prop up other movies. I remember seeing it several times, once with The Monster Club, because it was just like the old exploitation thing of the square up reel. Yeah, it's because it had giant spiders in it. And so no matter how disappointed you were by the whole evening's entertainment, you came away knowing you'd seen a film with giant spiders. But again, you have a feeling of sort of real people mixing with the faded Hollywood stars. The kind of blurry video look, which I suspect lasted as late as probably his last masterpiece, which would have been Blood Harvest, featuring Tiny Tim, the strange novelty act from the late 60s, playing actually another character with learning difficulties. That seems to be a Rebane theme, but somebody obsessed with clowns. And that's a severed heads on poles evil farm film. It's mostly Rebane wasn't working in the exploitation genres that were popular at the time that he was making films. He was making 1950s type science fiction films well into the 70s, and he was making 1970s occult horror films when everybody else was just making slasher movies. And finally in the late 80s he starts making slasher movies, and they're gone by then as well. So there's a literal stepping back in time feel to his work. And I do want to genuinely express my admiration for his films. I think that in a world where people are paying serious attention to Andy Milligan, Bill Rebane deserves his spot. And that's even setting aside the jokes about how difficult it is actually to watch Invasion from Inner Earth all the way through without falling asleep. I don't think I've ever managed it. I think it's always a rewind and try and catch up experience. But I think that there are genuine and interesting qualities in the Alpha Incident, in the giant spider invasion, in Demons of Ludlow, and in The Cold that we should pay attention to. I think he's worthy of rediscovery.